Hi, it's George from Any Old Music. In this week's video I want to discuss a book that shook my foundations as a composer. Written by philosopher and cognitive scientist Margaret Boden, the book is a compilation of essays called Creativity and Art, Three Roads to Surprise. Interested in artificial intelligence and the concept of artificial general intelligence, AGI, the essays explore and seek to understand human creativity through the problem of computational intelligence and creativity. From my perspective as a person who tries to be artistically creative in practice, I found the concepts presented in creativity and art fascinating. The reason being that, much like how music theory can reduce music compositions to a form or structure that makes them digestible, they can end up barely resembling the original piece. Similarly, doing so with creativity produces a similar detachment and potential dissonance between theory and practice. However, it is this dissonance and ambiguity that makes the concepts in Boden's essays, in my opinion, so seductive. As essays, Boden is positing her ideas, working out her thoughts through writing, rather than suggesting she's uncovered absolute truths regarding creativity. Obviously, that being said, she has published these essays as a compilation in her book, so she obviously backs the hypotheses and or underlying theses of each of these essays. However, it is in these developing ideas on such a broad subject that so many questions emerge. For instance, from what perspective are we understanding the creativity behind an artistic artifact? In other words, are we interpreting the creativity of another person through a thing they have created? And if so, is that the right way to go about it? The essays themselves seem to switch perspective, depending on the concepts being discussed. However, for myself, I found the concepts Boden unearths compelling in trying to understand my practice and the creative approaches I take as a composer. In this article, therefore, I want to focus on the concepts and why I found them significant. In doing so, I pick out three concepts that Boden puts forward in her essays. Two of these are explicitly outlined in the essays, while the third appears, in my opinion, implicitly as a result of the discourse in the essays. These are, firstly, P and H creativity, secondly, types of creativity, combinational, exploratory and transformational. These are the three roads to surprise in the subheading of the book. And the third one is conceptual space. So what are P and H creativity? Well, P creativity or psychological creativity is something that you do, learn or create that is inventive to you personally. For example, maybe you write a fugue. To you, this could be a significant creative feat, as it is the first time you have written a fugue. You feel accomplished, and so you should. However, to the world, unless you've struck on some piece of untouched musical magic, it's not historically creative or H creative. A fugue is an old form of music well traversed by many composers. Therefore, it is defined as P creativity, significant to you creatively, but not the world and music history. Conversely to this, H creativity is historical creativity, so in extending our fugue analogy, Bach is often attributed as the father of the fugue, not necessarily because he devised the form, as you know, forms tend to emerge themselves over time, but because he did many remarkable and historically creative things with the fugue. He wrote a tremendous amount of fugues. For example, the well-tempered clavier is a historical feat in Western classical composition, as composing fugues and preludes in the 24 major and minor keys was novel in the 18th century. To an extent, it held importance from an artistic and scientific perspective due to its exploration of the new well-tempered tuning system. Therefore, it has become regarded as historically significant and thus H creative. What is significant about this distinction is that it imposes an uncomplicated logic on how we can think about creativity generally. While psychological creativity can occur on its own, historical creativity cannot. To create something historically creative, you must be discovering or doing whatever you're doing for the first time as well. Therefore, P creativity can exist alone. H creativity must be P creative as well. I found this concept notable as it made me aware of my previously naive approach to music composition. In combination with another book, Creativity in Context, which I'm likely discuss in future, it made me realise how stupid it was to so doggedly pursue and expect originality of myself. Every composition felt like it had to reinvent the wheel if I was to compose something musically meaningful. You would probably think the concept of P and H creativity would have had the opposite effect and reinforced that previous approach or thinking behind composition. Without creativity in context and other influences, including other concepts within creativity and art, maybe it could have done. Furthermore, it's not to say I do not seek originality, but realising the logic behind the fact that to be historically creative, it needs to be, the first time for me as well, changed my approach to composition. My approach now is to take incremental steps as opposed to trying to take, one big leap. As opposed to reinventing the wheel, I try to look at the different things I've done and determine how I can, build upon them rather than just push them to one side and move on to something completely different. I ask questions like what worked, what did not work, what did I like, and how can I do that thing better next time. My logic being that if I find and do enough P creative things, you stand a better chance of doing something of H creative value. Although, at the same time, it sort of relieved me of that feeling anyway, and if I don't create anything H creative, so be it. Moving on to combinational, exploratory and transformational creativity then. These are ways in which we can engage with creativity, in creativity. Or in other words, they are forms that creativity can take, labels that we can use to try and distinguish them. And I'll now try to offer, a few concise definitions of each one. Combinational creativity is the synthesis of two or more disparate ideas to create something novel. Boden defines this form of creativity as the easiest. For example, we might combine salsa with Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Here the arranger combines the familiar motif of Beethoven's Fifth with the tropes of salsa music. The listener's interpretation and enjoyment therefore largely stems from an appreciation and awareness of said combinations. A fun arrangement, this supports Boden's further assertion that the ideas tend to need to be familiar for the creative artifact to be appreciated, although I only think in practice that matters from the audience's perspective, which is not always the same as the creators. As a composer, you might want to actually veil the combinations and their origins. However, this is where the fuzziness lies, as I've said in Boden's argument. From what perspective or perspectives are we understanding the creative approach when discussing these concepts? The creator, the actor or performer, or the audience? Exploratory creativity is where the creator identifies an aesthetic or conceptual space and uses it to inform their creative decision making. Or alternatively, the thing you are creating becomes a vessel through which you are engaging and discovering things about a conceptual space. Boden does not offer much explanation on what she means by conceptual spaces, beyond alluding to them being a form of widely understood aesthetics. Much like how an audience might appreciate the combinational creativity of a composition by identifying its components, an audience enjoys and critiques exploratory creativity through an understanding of underlying aesthetic. This understanding may be implicitly understood or explicitly laid out, possibly by the artist offering programming information. Exploratory creativity, therefore, is more an exploitation and confluence of multiple tenets within an aesthetic. Therefore, the audience identifies this aesthetic style or conceptual space and appreciates and enjoys what the artist has done within that space. The conceptual space acts, in a way, as the creative context for both artist and audience. Artist to create, audience to engage, or at least that's the theory. Transformational creativity is similar to exploratory creativity in that it relies on conceptual space in much the same way. However, rather than creating or admiring the artifact as a confluence of characteristics that make it stylistically aesthetic, the creative artifact combines or does something unexpected with one of the characteristics or multiple characteristics, shifting our understanding or perspective of the conceptual space itself. In comparison, as a generalization, we might say that exploratory creativity is an effort to deepen understanding of a conceptual space, perhaps for the author themselves of the creative artifact, although it would hopefully have an impact on the audience too, while transformational creativity is an effort to alter our understanding of the conceptual space, expand it, pivot it into a new direction or place. I guess an example of this could be classicism and then neoclassicism. If we take Prokofiev's Symphony No. 1, who didn't actually like the term neoclassical apparently, in exploring classical style through the prism of his compositional craft, his own craft, as an early 20th century composer, and obviously the time that had passed since the heyday of classical music in the 18th century, we're now in like early modern music, early 20th century, we've had romantic music as well. He creates a composition that counterpoints and deepens our understanding of classical music by making us hyper-aware of its aesthetic tenets. In other words, he's exploring classicism himself. However, it also has a transformational impact through its historical detachment, positing the question, what might a classical composer compose now, or rather in the early 20th century? In a way, neoclassicism is the conceptual transformation of classicism through revisitation, although that might itself be a controversial way of looking at this. I find these three forms of creativity notable in many ways. One of these is in that there is a dissonance between theory and practice, in that the theory can delineate these forms of creativity. However, in practice, when you apply them to things, they become fuzzier around the edges. After all, there is no one arbiter of aesthetics. Cultures and societies may provide groups of general appreciation, but even within these groups, there are individuals. Despite this, I think it's more than worthwhile and even helpful to try and distinguish forms of creativity. As a philosopher like Boden, a scientist, or as a composer or artist. The reason being they provide a way of understanding creativity that at the very least offers a means of trying to control it, for lack of a better way of putting it. What I mean by this is that if you are working on a composition, inspiration might not be striking. Understanding creativity in different ways offers you, I suppose, different strings to your bow, weapons in the arsenal, if you like, for trying to get that creativity started, get the ball rolling. If you find yourself stuck in a rut, you can start to posit questions to yourself regarding the types of creativity that we've outlined. It could be, what 2 or 3 things could I combine to create something quickly and novel? Or what are the underlying aesthetic attributes or conceptual space of this composition, this commission maybe, or project? For example, a few years ago I composed several cues for a video game that parodied sci-fi thrillers and B-movies of the 40s and 50s. The beauty of this project was that it established an aesthetic to write the music in the style of these films. I therefore explored tropes, even cliches, and the musical language of these films. As a result of this, rather than taking shots in the dark, the understanding of the conceptual space gave me a framework for validating my sketches, which made composing surprisingly straightforward. This is probably a good point at which to pivot into conceptual space. We've already established that is essentially the aesthetic qualities of a style. A creative artifact, in a sense, is that the entity that comes from an individual's engagement with a conceptual space, or that creative artifact is the point at which the artist is engaging and exploring through the creative space. They're exploring through the thing they're trying to create. Or it could be, the critical perspective that an individual interprets and critiques a creative artifact from. In combination with the 3 types of creativity, conceptual space becomes a kind of boundary, a boundary that might pre-exist being constructed over time, or it might be one that we have to put up ourselves within a project. This boundary delineates the areas within which the creative individual or group creates their artwork. To make this easier to explain, I like to form an analogy. Thinking about conceptual space in this way and how we interact with it as composers could be compared to planning a holiday. To have a worthwhile trip, we probably want to define a few things that we would want to do on this holiday. Otherwise, our holiday stories will be pretty bland when we come home and friends and family, our audience, ask us what we did and we say, not a lot. Similarly, if we pick too much to do, they could become a disorganised cacophony to the point where we try to fit too much in, and the stories we tell when we come back are just laden with so many cool things that people get bored by the awesome stories we've got to tell. Therefore, we want to pick out understandable things that allow us to learn about the place we've been to. Likewise, when we compose our stories for people, we pick out entertaining and communicable details, not everything. Composing is much the same. We identify conceptual space and we explore it through our composition. However, our compositions are not the trip itself, but the story we tell of that trip. We don't take all the details and nuances of conceptual spaces and throw them into a cauldron hoping they might make something nice. Rather, we cherry pick the ingredients and try to place them together in a recipe. We compose a piece. As I said at the start, Boden's essays are not trying to present absolute truth regarding creativity in art. Rather, they present a developing discourse or snapshot into Boden's incredibly deep thoughts on the matter. Furthermore, like with any theoretical exploration of something so complex, the process of reduction or generalization creates ambiguities and dissonances between theoretical thinking and actually putting things into practice, or how they appear in the real world. Just like the musical analysis I present on this YouTube channel, there's a degree of creative play demanded on the reader. You have to connect the dots between the reduced theory and the creative artifact, the composition or the compositional practice. It is in my own creative play with the text that shaped my approach to composition so significantly, inviting engagement and thus effort to apply and become more cognizant of my creative approach to music composition. The concepts have greatly impacted me as a composer and creative thinker. Much like my analogy of conceptual space, we cherry pick the theory that we want to present in practice.